Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to welcome all of you, and it's wonderful for me to be able to welcome three fantastic colleagues. First of all, this is Katherine Lerner Lee, known to some of us as Katie, who is singing the role of Coco Chanel in today's concert, and wow, she's fantastic. She may look the part too, I don't know, because I don't really know what she looked like, but she certainly sounds great. And then some of you will remember Mikhail Johnson, who was with us last year for a concert when we played not one or two, but three of his pieces on a concert, and they were all wonderful. Yay! Scott Wheeler, who wrote the piece based on Coco Chanel, is here too. Scott is an old friend. He's a young old friend, whose works we've done on many occasions in the past. Really a terrific composer. He's also someone who led, I think for many years, started and led Dinosaur Annex, which is one of the really terrific new music groups in Boston. And during that time, when we were doing works of Scott's, I also went up and guest conducted Dinosaur Annex several times and had just a terrific time working with the group. It's really great. So we have many connections. It's really great to have Scott back. And in this case, since we were doing his piece, I asked Scott if he would actually conduct it so that I could reciprocate his having had me up to conduct his group. So he's doing the piece, and he even seems to know the piece pretty well. It's interesting, I don't know. So it's working out beautifully. It's wonderful to have all of you with us. I'm gonna start out, actually, before I invoke all of you, to just say a few words about the program in a general way. So this year, as you may know, we're celebrating the Hirshhorn Museum's 50th anniversary this year. It also happens to be the 21st Century Concert's 50th season, and we're looking forward to our anniversary, which is next fall. But this year we've addressed our programming to this incredible exhibition, which I hope you all have visited or will visit many times, as I have, which is called Revolutions, works from the collection, the Hirshhorn collection from 1860 to 1960. If you've seen the exhibition, you'll note that they've snuck in new works too, and so cleverly curated the relationships between these works from the earlier period and the new. So it's a fantastic exhibition and reveals the depth and breadth and quality of the Hirshhorn collection. Quite something. So our season has been, in various ways, sort of picking up on this exhibition and doing some earlier works than we normally do. One particular piece, and I may be repeating what's in the notes, but one piece was absolutely inevitable in connection with an exhibition called Revolutions, and that is The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky's piece, which was truly revolutionary in its time. It's famous for having caused riots, etc. But the stunning thing about it, if you put all that aside, is just to think about all the music you love from before 1913. Just think about it, any music you love. And then think about this piece in relation to that. It was so utterly unprecedented and startling and also violent, really, and brutal. I hesitate to admit how much I love the piece, given those qualities, but it is an incredible work. I've been thinking recently about other brutal and unprecedented revolutionary things that we're maybe experiencing in our own day, and contrasting in my mind how much more I love Stravinsky. But be that as it may, this was a work that lands really right in the middle of that 100-year stretch from 1860 to 1960, and really represents revolution in its purest form in our field. I think if you consider works by, for example, Picasso, you can feel as we speak, and also an unprecedented sort of almost violent departure from norms in his work. And as a matter of fact, Picasso and Stravinsky worked together. Picasso designed sets for Stravinsky ballets, and they were connected. So it makes so much sense to do The Rite of Spring on this program. And if we have time, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this version of the piece that we're doing, the original piano four hands version, performed first by, unbelievably, by Stravinsky and Debussy playing the two pianos. Can you imagine that? It's so amazing. So we'll talk about it if we can, but you probably all know the piece well, maybe more likely in the orchestral form. Hearing it in its sort of, in the purity, sort of the skeletal bones of the piece on piano is a remarkable experience, so I'm excited about it. And then the milieu in which Stravinsky and Picasso intersected was also Coco Chanel's milieu. So when the idea arose for a new work by Scott Wheeler based on Coco Chanel, it was a wonderful opportunity really to knit all these elements together in a program. Turns out that Chanel's legacy has connections to the Hirshhorn too, which made it even more meaningful. But aesthetically and in connection with this exhibition, it's really a wonderful opportunity. So in addition to those two pieces, the Coco Chanel piece by Scott, I'm sorry, I'll get to you in a second, and the Stravinsky, we also have two other pieces, one contemporary almost with the Stravinsky, which you'll see, and the other by Mikhail Johnson, which, any excuse to do his work is welcome for us. It's amazing writing. And in this case, the title of the piece, which I'm going to ask you to pronounce, because you'll pronounce it more convincingly than I, but it obviously opened up an opportunity, if for no other reason than punning, in a way, to connect it with the Coco Chanel piece. So we'll get to you in a second, but this guy has something he wants to say.
I'm Scott, and I just wanted to jump in about Chanel with the Rite of Spring. She was good friends with Diaghilev and Picasso and Stravinsky, and actually helped to fund. She had already made enough money at her fashion that she was able to fund one of the early productions.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting, Scott. Huh. Okay. Super. Well, we'll hear more about that and other things. But I'm going to start, because it's first on the program, with Mikhail. If you see this setup over here, that's devoted to his piece. And I'm only going to say this about the piece before we ask him to, which is that the two performers are indefatigable percussionist Lee Hinkle and clarinetist Paul Seigan have been, I guess I can admit this, sweating bullets over this piece. It is so hard. It's really difficult, but they're loving the challenge and doing it. So anyway, so first, just tell us about the title of the piece and what were you doing with that when you wrote this piece?
Well, it started with the pandemic. Smack in the middle of it, everything shut down. Just when I thought I had my creative juices flowing and my way of moving from one thing to the next, and my safe space, as it were, which is not necessarily my home in which to be creative, all of a sudden that changed in the blink of an eye, and now what has become the space that I've psychologically put aside as a place to do nothing has now become the place to do everything. And in that moment, that became psychological warfare, and I was not able to even write for 8 months. And that was a moment in time where I had recently won this amazing commission with Transient Canvas for bass clarinet and marimba. And I was like, how am I going to write this? Of course, the deadline is looming, you know, the clock, and you know, the world keeps spinning. And they were gracious enough to say, hey, we understand. Don't even worry about it. Once it's ready, we'll be definitely ready to engage with it. Nice. And as soon as I started creating ideas, it was more of that kind of push to create something that was viscerally exciting and happy in the midst of this darkness that I was experiencing. And so the title just came about in the middle of me, basically like towards the 2/3 of writing the piece. Yeah. It was still a struggle, and I just didn't know what to title it. In my mind, I was just like, well, let's just try and get the piece out first before I even think of anything else. And surprisingly, and I'm starting to realize this is somewhat of a trend, that my titles somehow end up becoming double entendres in some way, shape, or form. And so the title "Turn Your Hand, Make Fashion" is Jamaican expression, which means, or poorly translated, to turn your hand and make fashion, which has two meanings. One, to make something that was once deemed useless, rework it in a way that's now become useful. Second interpretation is to make the most of an unfortunate situation. And so in that respect, I took the bass clarinet that has quite an extended range, but also goes into the regular clarinet range. And then the marimba, which has a very percussive undertone, but it's reminiscent of this particular instrument in Jamaica called the rumba box. Or in other cultures, I think in more Spanish-speaking cultures like Cuba, it is known, surprisingly, as the marimbula. Oh. So I did not realize that, but to me, the instrument sounded just like it, especially in its lower register, and I decided to use that as the impetus of creating, as it were, this band out of two instruments.
Are the two instruments the useless objects that you turn?
They're not useless. To me, it's, in that case, in the case of the instrument, is making the most out of that situation. For me, it's just creating joy, but using that as the catalyst and the conduit or the vehicle to recreate that. But I only had two instruments, but I was recreating a band in a way that you'll have, usually in a mentor band or folk band, you'll have the guitar, the banjo. If there's some kind of soloistic instrument, it could be like a very reedy, maybe saxophone-esque, but it's very like harsh. There's no kind of like refinement in that sound, or a fife. And then you'll have the singer, and then you have like, you know, shakers and so on. So you kind of have a good collection of instruments, and to dwindle that down to just two, it was me basically creating variations on a theme of a two-man band. So instead of me talking about theme and variations as people would normally know, I actually play with the dynamics of how they interact.
And the form of the piece is very, I mean, it's...
Yeah, it is a set of variations, but it's not in the way you think. It's not variations on a theme or melodic material. It's variations on dynamic interplay. So for example, I will have the instrument who's known to be a soloistic instrument become accompaniment, while the one that's supposed to be accompaniment becomes soloistic, and vice versa. Other times I have abandoned that entirely and they become both a percussion section, and then I'll bring them back again, and one of them is giving an idea of like guitar strumming patterns, the other is giving percussive elements that are representing like shakers or something like that. So it's basically creating these elements of a mento band, but in the case of that. So it's just more for an exuberance of joy and kind of like doing that to the bitter end. So I guess they're sweating bullets because they're kind of like bringing my joy out of that struggle.
The joy part will emerge in the performance today, and we're counting on all of you to experience it, even if the performers are, in the immortal words of Mstislav Rostropovich, martyrs for music. But it is truly an exuberant piece and quite virtuosic. Mikhail is himself a very accomplished pianist. And I'm just going to ask you the question, and Scott may have things to say about this too, but in writing for a mallet instrument, which rather than 10 digits, or in the case of the Stravinskys, you'll hear 20, the mallet really, in a way, has max of 4. So how do you, I mean, it's exceedingly challenging mallet writing, but you somehow you have to, I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but Mikhail's keyboard writing is quite brilliant, really, really wonderful, and you've written a lot for keyboard. It's your instrument. But how did you, was it a question of paring it down in a way to make it doable with 4 mallets instead of 10 digits?
Yes and no. I am a sucker for overcomposing. Yikes. And particularly for keyboard. And I think that was why I avoided writing for that instrument for so long, even though it was my main instrument, because you know the instrument so well that you think you had to throw everything in there all at once. And it's not until I get to experience other instruments that I'm not privy to or have any thorough knowledge of, I realize how efficient and effective things can be with less. And the same way you can, that this idea of turning your hand make fashion, this kind of thing in your mind where you're kind of like, oh, these ideas are so exploding in my head and I have to do all of this. And there's a way in which you kind of have to make do with just a little kernel and just trust that that information will be enough. And even in this context, you might feel as though the marimba goes on and on forever, which, that's also the plight of the keyboardist, regardless of the instrumentation. Even in chamber music, they feel like they're playing a concerto, while the soloist is, reigning supreme.
Lee said that exact thing. He said, it's a concerto. But I think something you just said is worth noting for all of us listening to the piece, and that's how much the two instruments are real partners in their interplay and in who steps forward, who steps back, and who even is a percussionist or who's a line instrument. There's a kind of a shape-shifting thing that happens in the roles of these two instruments. It's pretty remarkable. So I think that I'm glad you said that. I think it's something to really listen for and note in the piece. That's great. So yeah, thank you for those observations. I mean, I want to jump to Scott, who's written so much, including a lot for percussion, and ask you too. I mean, there's percussion in your piece, not marimba, but there's another mallet instrument, and you're also a pianist.
Yes.
So how do you do that?
Well, I have played in jazz a lot, as you'll be able to hear from the music of my piece, and I'm very comfortable. What was new for me was not writing for vibraphone, which I've done a lot, but writing for trap set drums. Writing for the kind of drummer who plays for a club or a Broadway show or something like that. And so I actually worked with Lee directly on this. We talked about exactly what was going on. I had a percussionist friend named Jeff Myers up in Boston. I went over it with him, and he said, well, this should really be over this. And you know, he advised me on the part, and then I worked it out more with Lee. So being a pianist was no help at all, except that I like to play with drummers.
Just to squeeze in, there's one trick that my marimba colleague told me was, all you need to do is do this.
Right, yeah.
And if you can't play it on the keyboard, then it's not doable on the marimba. So you're like doing this, and you're like, ugh. Oh, that's weird. That's weird. Right. So that kind of helps you and give you some context, even though you won't be able to have the full effect. But yeah.
Sometimes it looks more like this.
But they tell you not to use the thumb because that can give a very weird or unassuming like length in terms of like span and stuff. But you use this, then you'll be a little bit more demure about it. You know?
Wait till you see what else he asks of the mallet player in this piece. It's quite
I'm
amazing.
saving that idea. I'm writing that down for next time I'm writing for marimba. Thank you.
The thing that that's good. So Scott, it was very interesting to sort of accompany you through your composition process with this piece and the sort of progression of discovering the lyrics and then writing the piece. So Scott and Katie actually performed the piece in its sort of another version for piano and voice, and did performance of it, and then you scored it. Were you thinking about I have to say the colors in Scott's scoring are quite remarkable, and he proposed this particular ensemble, which is larger than the ensembles we typically mount, but he proposed it, and I agreed because he should have at his disposal the resources he needs. But I hadn't anticipated quite how remarkable the sound of the pieces. I mean, it's definitely evokes cabaret, which it should, like in the trap set and stuff. But for example, the color of the trombone, muted in various ways or not, and the saxophone, really quite remarkable, and in my experience.
Thank you. I mean, of course, the subtitle, which I don't see in the program here, is it's a cabaret song cycle. So so what the audience might want to know, it's 12 songs, and they last 28 minutes, all together, and it's Coco telling about her life, and it begins as if, I don't know, a TED Talk or something like that. And she's going to explain to you about fashion. And throughout there, it's not a revolutionary piece in the way of Stravinsky, almost nothing is. But what it does do, that Stravinsky does, is a lot of different colors. His was a ballet, and I know we're going to hear in the piano version, even without the orchestral colors, how many different kinds of motion he has on that inspired dance. And I was conscious of looking for different kinds of musical forms, of dance forms. And so Katie and I were talking about that, the soft shoe and the waltz and the march and these things that were going on, which were very much things that were on Stravinsky's mind, if you look not just to the Rite of Spring, but to pieces like Petrushka and Pulcinella of that time. And then all of Les Six, all of the composers around that period that were working with Diaghilev, with Cocteau. Our Poulenc pieces are so much involved with this. And they were also open to the popular music, the entertainment music of their time, and they really do connect to the Edith Piaf, to the Josephine Baker, Mistinguet. I was thinking of all of these things. I talked to Katie about, when Coco Chanel is meeting soldiers and she's a poor girl, and I'm thinking of Mistinguet's song Je cherche un millionnaire. Well, it's a famous cabaret song, that sort of thing. But so back to your point about the instruments, of course, trombones and saxes would be part of the ensembles in a lot of these things, along with the drum set and the piano, and then the strings. And we do have strings in that period, and it's nice, and it connects. Anyway, and so the only way it's possible is if you have a singer who can cover the difficulties of the meter changes, the tricky pitches to do, and understand the style, including the diction, to give you an actual cabaret performance. And we've got to give major props to Katie Lee here. And I'd love to turn it over and ask her to talk about anything about her experience in this, or what she thinks the audience ought to know.
Yeah, please do. So, yeah, so if you talk about the scoring of the piece, it's an ensemble that sort of fleshed out the piano skeleton, but it's all in the service of supporting the characterization and sounds that Coco is making, and that's your job. How's it going?
My job. We're gonna find out, but it's been fun so far.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been one of the best challenges of Scott's piece to tackle all of these different genres in one go. It has a lot of elements of contemporary chamber music. You mentioned the rhythmic changes. Inconsistent phrase length, that kind of thing. But it certainly draws so much from cabaret, musical theater. There's spoken text, there's metered rhythmic spoken text, and then there's off-the-cuff, one-liners. And I think it really speaks to what a layered person Coco Chanel was. I think there's such a rich parallel to draw between what you said about Stravinsky, and that you can draw a line from almost any piece written after Rite of Spring to Rite of Spring. And in that way, especially for women's fashion, but probably for all clothes, there's a pretty direct line to be drawn from Coco Chanel to anything that we continue to wear today, and wear it without even thinking about it. My trousers, my shirt. She really, many people have said that she liberated the female body, that she wanted women to be able to move and do anything in clothes. And I at least take that for granted now. But it's kind of amazing. But beyond that, she was, yes, this singular entrepreneur, one-of-a-kind woman. And she was also a deeply unique person, a lonely person, a troubled person. She did great things, she did terrible things. And she presented herself to the world in this multi-layered fashion where you almost never know if what she's saying is true or if it's a version of herself that she would like to believe. And I think that is it's treated really, really well with Scott's music and all the different styles and different character switches. So it's a great challenge, it's a lot of fun, and yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear your approach to the character, and I'm sure it aligns beautifully with Scott's feeling about it. Does it?
Of course. Absolutely. I have a song. I've been very interested for a long time in musical theater characters and opera characters who lie, who don't tell the truth. I have a song cycle called Lies I Tell Myself. So I wrote the lyrics for this, as you probably know. So I was working with Chanel's biography and with some of the things that she said. And as Katie says, she isn't trustworthy. And so the first spoken lines, some of the first spoken lines that I gave to Coco are, "You can trust me." She said, "You can trust me, it's the innocent and naive you have to watch out for." And so she's a complicated person, and Katie's got that. You'll see, it's fun to watch.
Yeah, and it is a cabaret cycle. I mean, this is not our usual fare as an ensemble, but it's a real pleasure to hear the piece. It's exceedingly listenable. the language is accessible. I would say more directly so than other works of yours, Scott, that we've played that maybe are in a different language and have had a different intent. But this one's very convincing as a cabaret cycle.
Oh, thanks. I'm a big fan of the American tradition of varying your style according to the situation. The most famous would probably be Bernstein, with his symphonies and his 12-tone explorations and his Broadway songs and other lighter works of all styles. But it's so true for so many American composers, Andre Previn. I think one should look at Duke Ellington, Charles Mingus. These are very, very important people to me. I've spent loads and loads of time with all kinds of American and other composers. I mean, back to this period, you'll have something like Milhaud's Bœuf sur le Toit. For that matter, really, Stravinsky's L'Histoire is a kind of a cabaret piece. I was working recently with the Prokofiev Quintet, which was written for Diaghilev, and is a dance piece. And I've written for ballet. I've written for dance as well. So I like being in a program that's about the modern art in this museum, because it reflects so much of what I do. So it is, yes, it's, on the other hand, no, I've never written anything that's really a Richard Rodgers or Harold Arlen ballad, which is what we get partway through this. And there's a Kander and Ebb tune in there as well. So I've conducted musical theater all my life, and many shows. Bernstein's On the Town is a great favorite that I've conducted. For instance, Candide of Bernstein, many Sondheim shows. So I'm drawing a little more directly on that repertoire than I have in some of the other pieces you know.
You've come home to Coco in this piece. Yeah, it's really wonderful. Well, so I can't resist using your comment about composers who have or change, their style according to the material that they're dealing with. And Stravinsky, maybe it doesn't quite fit into that category, but temporally, over time, his style of writing changed completely, dramatically from one period to the next, from l'Histoire to, the atonal pieces later in his career. He was a real shapeshifter during his career. And I guess Rite of Spring represents one of those dramatic changes. He had written Firebird and Petrushka before this, which in some ways are antecedents to this piece, but this piece, again, I think is unprecedented in a way. So I'd like to talk a little bit about it. It's the final piece on the program, and invite all of you too from your experience, because we all have experience with the piece. I mean, I've known it for so long. I think in the 1980s, I saw New York City Ballet do Rite of Spring in Martha Graham's choreography. And I'll never forget it. It was a stunning experience. I, of course, heard the music before that, but to see the ballet, and in her choreography, very abstract, not like Nijinsky's or many other productions of the work. It was very abstract, and I was a poor, itinerant musician, so I was sitting way up in the peanut gallery, and glad to be up there, because what unfolded on the stage was truly abstract, and I didn't really need to see the expressions on the dancers' faces. It was the way the forms, very angular and beautifully, richly colored forms, moved on the stage. And in a way, it was easier to absorb the piece and its sort of innate violence and barbarity in that beautifully conceived abstraction. In contrast to around the same time I saw Miraculous Mandarin, which is a ballet, a Bartok ballet, and it was so graphic and horrifying. I don't know if any of you, do any of you know Miraculous Mandarin as a ballet? Some of you have, well, you may know the music, but the ballet is also from that general period and also brutal, just so disturbing. And I felt almost sick after that ballet. But not the Stravinsky, because I was lucky enough to encounter the Martha Graham version of the piece. But its story, its images, and especially the music itself, evidently the dance in the original production, which is what caused the riots. But in the music itself, it is just an incredible thing to hear. And what I basically want to say here is that hearing the ballet or just hearing the music in a concert performance, it can be really an overpowering experience. The density and brutality, rhythmic brutality of that music can be overwhelming. And the amazing thing in hearing it on a piano is that we scale, at least I do, scale into the space that we have, this room, this instrument, without all those colors of the orchestra. And the power of the music is still there. It's still, fully embodied, even in this form. You'll decide. Many of you know this work. Maybe fewer of you know it from having heard piano version. There's also a 2-piano version. I think there's a solo piano version.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, which probably leaves a few things out. But this was the original, the piano 4 hands version. So we've got it set up. I think you're going to really enjoy the choreography. Not Nijinsky's choreography, but Lisa and Audrey's choreography on the keyboards, really quite amazing.
I just wanted to mention that there is something about Stravinsky's work and his ability to have his ideas transcend medium in a way that, even though there's some finessing that takes place, for some reason I see that there's this kind of translation that we hear or is normally synonymous with Bach. And so this kind of, and you usually would have composers start, especially if they're pianists, start from the instrument and eventually try use that as a way to scale much larger. But to have